Welcome to the new episode of History Revolution. How are you? Hope your week was fine. We are diving deep today into, well, one of the most critical analyses out there regarding modern conflict and revolution. We're looking at the economic engine that, according to our sources, drives it all, imperialism.
That's right.
And our mission really is to get past this simpler idea you sometimes hear that imperialism is just a bad policy or maybe a political choice some leaders make.
Exactly. It's much deeper. We're synthesizing some foundational analyses here, primarily looking at V.I. Lenin's work, Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. The goal is to define this phenomenon, not as some kind of preference, but as an inevitable historical stage, a structural part of capitalist development.
So the aim is to connect the economic dots for you listening, especially if maybe you're newer to this way of looking at world history.
Precisely. Helping to see the underlying structures.
And the core thesis is, well, it's pretty radical. It argues that the whole era of free competition, which people once thought was the absolute bedrock of capitalism,
Yeah, the defining feature.
is functionally dead, gone. It's been replaced by the absolute reign of monopoly.
Monopoly capital.
And this transformation, we'll trace how the argument goes, is the key structural issue, the contradiction that leads almost inevitably to global war and ultimately social revolution.
It's a huge claim, and we need to unpack it carefully.
Let's do that. Let's unpack this massive historical shift, kicking things off with Section 1, the historical transformation to monopoly.
Okay, so we really have to start with Karl Marx. Decades after he published Capital, you had mainstream bourgeois economists working overtime, really, trying to argue that his main prediction was wrong.
What prediction was that specifically?
His prediction that free competition, just through its own internal logic, its own dynamics, must eventually lead to the concentration of production. Basically, bigger fish eating smaller fish until only giants remain.
And they were trying to refute this.
Oh, absolutely. They desperately tried to say his work was, disproven, outdated, refuted by reality.
But the facts didn't quite cooperate, did they? The sources we're looking at emphasize that, well, facts are stubborn things.
Exactly. The actual economic reality, especially towards the end of the 19th century, proved Marx's analysis was spot on. The rise of monopoly wasn't just like a fluke or specific to one country's policies, like protectionism or free trade.
It wasn't about policy choices.
No, it became an objective, general, fundamental law of capitalist development itself. Capitalism was changing itself from the inside out, regardless of what politicians were debating.
Okay, so if it's a process, can we trace the stages? How did this happen over time?
Yes, the data lets us see a pretty clear timeline. Stage 1, let's say, runs roughly from 1860 to 1870. This period, according to the analysis, was the absolute high point, the apex of free competition.
So lots of small players, relatively speaking.
Thousands of enterprises, capital still quite scattered, competing more or less independently. Monopoly was barely visible, just in its embryonic stage, you could say.
Sounds almost quaint compared to today, but you're saying that phase didn't last long?
Not at all. The first really big global economic shock was the crisis of 1873. And that marks the end of that, well, innocent phase and the beginning of stage 2.
What happens in stage 2?
After 1873, for quite a long period, you start seeing cartels emerge. These are agreements, right, between supposedly competing firms to fix prices or divide up markets, set quotas, that sort of thing.
Ah, so collusion starts.
Right, but they weren't yet permanent or foundational. They were still seen more as temporary exceptions. Often they'd form during a boom and then collapse during the next downturn. Still fragile.
Okay, so cartels are appearing, but they haven't fundamentally changed the whole system's character just yet. When does that tipping point happen?
That's stage 3. This is really the point of no return, according to Lenin and others. It happens around the economic boom of the late 19th century, and it really solidifies during and after the next big crisis, the one from 1900 to 1903.
And what changes then?
At this point, cartels and monopolies stop being exceptions. They become one of the core foundations of all economic life. The whole atmosphere, especially in key industries, think mining, iron, steel, falls completely under what the sources call the aegis of the cartels.
The umbrella of the cartels.
Pretty much. This transition, this moment, is identified as the transformation of competitive capitalism into imperialism.
Okay, let's try and make this concentration concept more concrete. The numbers can be quite startling, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned U.S. statistics.
Yes, the U.S. data from the early 20th century is very revealing. They categorized industrial enterprises based on their annual output value.
So what do they find?
Well, take 1904 in the U.S. You had over 216,000 industrial enterprises in total.
Yeah, a lot of businesses.
And here's the key, only 1,900 of those firms, which is less than 1%, just 0.9% of the total number. Only those had an annual output valued at $1 million or more.
Wow. Less than 1% were these really big players.
Tiny fraction. Yet get this, these 1,900 giant firms employed 25.6% over a quarter of the entire industrial workforce.
Okay.
And they accounted for a massive 38% of the total value of industrial output.
So less than 1% of firms generating almost 40% of the value? That's incredible concentration.
It is. And it was speeding up. By 1909, just 5 years later, the number of these giant enterprises had jumped from 1,900 to 3,060.
Still a small percentage overall, but growing fast.
And we're not just talking simple monopolies here, like one company dominating one product. We're seeing combination.
What do you mean by combination?
It's where a single enterprise groups together different stages of production. Imagine one company that controls the iron ore mining, then the smelting, then the pig iron conversion, and the steel manufacturing, the whole chain.
Vertical integration on a massive scale.
Exactly. It captures the entire process, squeezing out competitors at every stage.
Which effectively eliminates competition entirely in that whole sector. So once these cartels and combinations dominate, what do they actually do? They can't be behaving like those small competing firms from the 1860s, right?
Not even close. Their function becomes essentially dictatorship over the market. They stop competing on price or quality in the way textbooks describe. Instead, they fix prices deliberately high. They divide up the markets geographically or by product type. They set production quotas for each member firm.
Controlling supply.
Precisely. And they agree on the exact terms of sale. The whole goal is to eliminate uncertainty, eliminate competition, and guarantee the maximum possible profits through total market control. It's the opposite of free competition.
You mentioned the German cement industry as an example of how this dictation works.
Yes, it's a really good case study. Because, the raw materials for cement, limestone, they're actually abundant and widely available almost everywhere.
So theoretically, it should be a highly competitive industry with low prices.
You'd think so, but it was heavily cartelized in Germany.
How did they manage to keep profits so high if the basic inputs were cheap and easy to get?
Through straightforward monopoly pricing, the cartels agreed to fix prices way above the actual cost. The sources cite figures like 230 to 280 marks per carload, when the real cost price was only about 180 marks.
That's a huge markup, guaranteed by collusion.
Huge. And it ensured very high dividends for the cartel members, often 12 to 16%, which was enormous back then. And to maintain this artificial profitability, they waged outright war, commercial war, against any firms that dared to operate outside the cartel or refused to join.
What kind of warfare are we talking about? Not literal violence, presumably.
Usually not literal, but definitely financial violence. The sources describe a whole range of predatory tactics. They'd spread false rumors deliberately, saying the industry was in a bad state to scare off new investors.
Psychological operations, almost.
You could say that. They published anonymous warnings in newspapers basically telling outside capitalists, don't even think about investing your capital in the cement industry. And most aggressively, they would sometimes pay huge sums. The figure of 150,000 marks is mentioned specifically to buy out or just financially ruin outsider firms. Firms that wouldn't submit to the cartel's absolute dictatorship.
So it's coercion, pure and simple. Submit or be destroyed.
That's the message. It is the complete antithesis of free enterprise. It's dictation backed by financial power.
This extreme concentration, this cartelization, it seems to create a really deep tension within the system itself. Marxists often point to this as a core contradiction, right? The clash between how production gets organized and who gets the rewards.
Yes, absolutely. The conflict between the socialization of production and the private appropriation of profit.
How does monopoly lead to the socialization of production? It sounds almost counterintuitive.
It's maybe the most fascinating irony here. Monopoly, just because of its sheer scale, brings about what Lenin calls immense progress in the socialization of production. Think about it. A giant trust, like U.S. Steel or Standard Oil, has to organize production on a massive, almost centrally planned scale internally.
They need incredible coordination.
Incredible coordination. They organize technical improvements, not just for one factory, but across maybe dozens, even across continents. They need foresight. They have to estimate all the sources of raw materials, say, all the iron ore deposits in a whole country or even globally and try to capture them.
Control the inputs.
Control the inputs. They have to calculate the maximum capacity of the market they control. And they often end up monopolizing shared infrastructure to major railway lines, shipping companies, just to ensure distribution is under their control.
So the actual work of making things, the technology, the planning, the logistics, coordinating maybe hundreds of thousands of workers, becomes this huge, consolidated social effort. It almost resembles state planning in its scope.
Exactly. The production process itself becomes inherently socialized, highly interdependent, and organized. However, and here's the big contradiction, the profits, the enormous dividends generated by this hyper-organized system, they remain strictly private.
Going to a tiny group at the top.
To a handful of monopolists. So this process, this concentration, it drags the individual capitalists, almost against their will or conscious understanding, into a completely new kind of social order, this highly organized industrial world. But the wealth generated by this new order benefits only the few who wield this unprecedented centralized power. The system organizes itself socially, but its rewards remain purely individual.
That core contradiction, socialized production, private profit, that seems like the engine driving things to the next stage. Because these giant enterprises, they need huge amounts of capital for their global plans, for controlling infrastructure.
Right.
And they have to turn to the banks.
Right.
Which brings us neatly to Section 2, the coalescence of capital and the rise of the financial oligarchy.
Perfectly put. Concentration of production leads to monopoly. The next critical step, the next transformation, is the merging or coalescence, which is a great term. And Bukharin used the merging of the banks with these giant industrial monopolies.
And this merger, this blend.
This blend of banking capital and industrial capital is the essence, the content of what we call finance capital.
How did this change what banks do? My image of a bank is, it takes deposits, it gives out loans, kind of an intermediary.
Well, historically, that was more accurate. Banks used to perform mainly technical, auxiliary, or intermediary functions for lots of scattered smaller industrialists. But as capital concentrates in industry, the banks concentrate too. They grow enormous, and their function radically shifts.
How does it shift?
Marx had already foreseen this. He called them institutions of universal bookkeeping. They stop being just intermediaries and become something much more powerful, the central nervous system of the entire capitalist economy.
Can we get a sense of the scale of this change? Is there an example?
Yeah, look at a major Parisian bank, the Crédit Lyonnais. It was one of the biggest. The number of its accounts tells a dramatic story. In 1875, it had about 20,535 accounts. Okay, a decent size.
Okay.
By 1912, that number had exploded to 633,539 accounts.
Whoa, from under 30,000 to over 600,000.
It's not just growth, it's an aggregation, a concentration of the financial lifeblood of society into one place.
And having all that information, all those accounts,
Yeah.
that must give the people running that bank incredible insight and power over the economy, almost like omniscience.
That's exactly the point. This massive scale gives a handful of monopolists, the ones controlling the few dominant banking houses, the actual ability to subordinate and control pretty much all commercial and industrial operations across the whole society.
Oh, can they do?
They can ascertain the precise financial position of almost any firm. They know who's borrowing, who's lending, who's profitable, who's struggling. They can control or manipulate a company's expansion by simply restricting or facilitating credit. And ultimately, they can determine the income, the fate, even the very survival of other capitalists.
So the power shifts.
Definitively, it shifts away from the industrialist, who traditionally had to obey the chaotic signals of the market, towards the banker, who now controls the flow of capital itself, the lifeblood.
It really does sound like a financial dictatorship. And this small group wielding this power is what we call the financial oligarchy.
Correct. Born from this structure.
But how do just a few individuals manage to control billions and billions in capital? Surely they don't personally own all of it.
No, not at all. That's where the holding system comes in. It's a mechanism for leveraging control. Financial magnates gain power by controlling a significant, but not necessarily majority, share of stock in key companies.
How much is enough?
Experience showed, and the sources confirm, that owning just 40% of the shares is usually quite sufficient to direct a company's affairs effectively.
Why only 40%? Why not 51%?
Because the remaining shares are typically held by thousands of small, scattered shareholders. These are ordinary people, maybe, who own a few shares here and there. They rarely, if ever, attend the general meetings. They lack the information, the time, the coordination to actually challenge the decisions made by the management, which is controlled by the big blockholders.
So the apathy or powerlessness of the small shareholder is actually crucial for the power of the magnate.
It's institutionalized apathy, you could say. It's built into the structure. In fact, the sources cite things like the so-called democratization of shares, like when Britain introduced smaller one-pound shares being presented by apologists as a way to, spread capital ownership more widely.
Making everyone a capitalist, supposedly.
Right. But in reality, according to this analysis, it was a key method for increasing the power of the financial oligarchy. Why? Because it created even more small, dispersed shareholders who were easy to control.
That's quite cynical.
The German financial king Siemens apparently called the British one-pound share the basis of British imperialism, precisely for this reason. It allowed the magnates to control vast sums of capital belonging to other people with only a relatively minimal personal investment, thereby accelerating the concentration of power even further.
That completely reframes the idea of popular investment. So if the power is this concentrated at the top, how does it look geographically? Is it just a few people in each country?
The concentration is staggering. The sources note that in Germany around this time, the analysis was that the entire country was effectively governed by no more than 300 key magnates of capital.
200 people.
And that number was constantly shrinking through mergers, acquisitions, and internal alliances. In France, the structure was very similar. One observer, Lysis, called it the trust of big banks. He argued that just 4 incredibly powerful banking institutions held an absolute monopoly over issuing bonds and other crucial financial instruments.
An absolute monopoly on issuing debt. What kind of profit margins did they make from that position?
Massive, essentially usurious monopoly profits, just for facilitating the transaction, for using their monopoly position. For instance, in 1904, these big French banks reportedly took a 10% cut right off the top of a major Russian loan.
10%.
And even more shocking, they took an 18.75% commission on a Moroccan loan. They're essentially collecting tribute, huge sums, just for controlling access to capital.
So the argument is that capitalism starts with petty moneylenders, petty usury.
And it ends its development with gigantic finance capital doing essentially the same thing, but on a global scale, simply extracting wealth. Not necessarily through production, but through controlling the financial levers.
And they don't just do this at home, right? This model gets exported. The banks from the dominant countries effectively colonize the banking systems elsewhere.
Oh, absolutely. You saw this very clearly in, say, the biggest Russian banks just before World War I. On paper, they were Russian banks, but the analysis showed that more than 3/4, maybe 80% of their actual working capital belonged in reality to foreign banks.
Which ones?
Mainly daughter companies or affiliates of the big Parisian and Berlin banks like the Deutsche Bank. The country exporting the capital, like Germany or France, essentially skims the cream twice. First, they make enormous promoters' profits just by placing the shares of these foreign daughter banks onto their own domestic stock markets. And second, they control the flow of capital into that foreign country. They're exporting control itself.
This incredible centralization of colossal amounts of finance capital in just a few advanced nations. It forces us to look outwards, which leads us to Section 3. The inevitable need to export capital, which then leads directly to the partition of the world. Why couldn't all this capital just stay home and be invested domestically?
This gets to the core of the inherent stagnation argument within this theory. The sources argue that capitalism in these few leading countries had become overripe.
Overripe. What does that mean?
It means it was suffering from structural internal limits that prevented profitable investment at home. There was too much capital chasing too few profitable opportunities domestically.
What were those specific limits or contradictions?
2 main problems are highlighted. First, the system consistently fails to develop agriculture sufficiently. Agriculture tends to lag terribly behind industry under this model. And second, crucially, the system actively resists raising the living standards of the broad masses of the population.
Why? Why not raise living standards? Wouldn't that create more demand?
It would, but raising wages significantly, or improving conditions to the point where poverty is genuinely reduced, would mean a necessary decline in the super profits that the capitalists, especially the monopolists, demand. If you have to pay higher wages, your profit margin shrinks. It's a fundamental antagonism.
So the system generates this enormous pool of surplus capital, because it's maximized exploitation at home, but by doing so, it's also choked off potential domestic demand from the masses, who remain, as the sources say, half-starved and poverty-stricken.
Exactly. You have this glut of capital that cannot find a sufficiently profitable field for investment at home. The home market is oversaturated with capital seeking high returns, but it's undersaturated with actual purchasing power among the population. So that surplus capital must be exported. It has to go abroad.
And it slows to what were then called backward countries. Why were profits supposedly higher there?
For a few key reasons, according to the theory. First, capital was still relatively scarce in those regions, so the price of capital, the expected return, was higher. Second, wages were incredibly low, often subsistence level or below. Third, raw materials were extremely cheap, often acquired through colonial force. And fourth, land was either very cheap or simply taken.
So lower costs and higher potential returns.
Plus, crucially, these regions weren't entirely isolated. They had already been drawn into the global capitalist network, often through the building of infrastructure like railways, frequently financed by exported capital itself, which made large-scale investment feasible.
And we saw different patterns of this capital export, depending on the specific imperial power around, say, 1910, reflecting their different kinds of global reach.
That's right. The forms varied. Great Britain, with its absolutely vast colonial empire, naturally invested the majority of its exported capital within its own colonies and dominions. This is the classic model of colonial imperialism.
Okay. What about France?
France was different. It invested predominantly in Europe, not so much in its colonies, and a huge chunk of it went into government loans, especially to Russia. The figure mentioned is at least 10 billion francs. This focus on lending, particularly to governments, is what the sources characterize as usury imperialism. France was acting like a giant international moneylender, extracting tribute via interest payments on sovereign debt.
And Germany.
Germany represented a third model. Its exported capital was divided more evenly, roughly half going to other European countries and half going to the Americas. Its actual colonies were relatively small and less significant for capital export compared to Britain's.
Now, you mentioned something intriguing earlier, that foreign investment allows the exporting country to skin the ox twice. How does that work? How does exporting capital guarantee commercial advantages too?
It's a kind of built-in feedback loop. The loan or the investment is rarely just pure, untied cash given with no strings attached. First, as we said, the bank in the exporting country pockets a huge promoter's profit just for arranging and floating the loan. That's the first skinning. Second, the money from the loan is very often, sometimes explicitly by contract, required to be used by the borrowing country to purchase goods from the lending country. Things like railway equipment, industrial machinery, or weapons.
Oh, so the capital flows out as a loan, but then flows right back as payment for exports.
Exactly. It returns home, but now enriched by a second layer of profit, the commercial profit made by the exporting country's industries.
And we have data showing this wasn't just a theory, it was actually happening.
Yes, absolutely. German export figures from that period are cited as strong evidence. They apparently show that German exports to countries that were financially dependent on Germany, places like Argentina, Chile, Romania, grew significantly faster than German exports to countries that were financially independent. The commercial advantage tied to capital export seems undeniable in the data.
Can you give a specific concrete example of this loan-to-sales pipeline?
Sure. The sources point to 1906, when German banks floated a new loan to Chile. This was immediately followed by a noticeable jump in Chilean purchases from major German industrial firms, specifically mentioning Krupp, Arms and Steel, and the German Steel Syndicate.
So German finance capital makes money on the loan.
And then German heavy industry makes money on the resulting sales financed by that same loan. The pattern apparently repeated consistently with countries like Argentina, Brazil, Turkey, Portugal, wherever German finance capital was making inroads.
It's like a closed circuit designed for the perpetual enrichment of the capital exporting nation's elite.
That's the argument.
By the way, if you liked and interested so far, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. It's really important for us to continue this series.
Okay.
So this aggressive drive, this need to find profitable outlets abroad for surplus capital, it had a monumental, world-altering consequence, didn't it? The final division of the entire globe among these powers.
Yes. This is a crucial turning point. The geographer A.C. Pan tracked this statistically, looking at the seizure of colonial territory, particularly between 1876 and 1900, the speed is breathtaking.
Especially in certain regions.
Look specifically at Africa and Polynesia. In 1876, European colonial powers claimed only about 10.8% of Africa's territory. Just 24 years later, by 1900, that figure had skyrocketed to 90.4%.
90%, almost the entire continent carved up in less than a generation.
And Polynesia saw a similar leap, from about 56.8% colonized in 1876 to nearly 99% by 1900. Essentially, all the islands were claimed.
The conclusion from this rapid division is profound, especially for understanding the conflicts of the 20th century.
And absolutely profound, because for the first time in human history, the entire world is completely divided up among a handful of major capitalist powers. There are no more significant unoccupied territories left to seize, no more frontiers in the old sense.
So what does that mean for future expansion? If a power wants to grow its sphere, it's access to markets and resources.
It means that future expansion can no longer happen through seizing ownerless land. From this point forward, any change in the territorial division, any gain for one power, can only come at the expense of another existing power. Expansion now necessitates repartition. Territory must pass from one owner to another.
And that structural reality, the fact that the world is full and further gains require taking from others.
That is the structural basis, the built-in guarantee for the intense conflict and ultimately the wars that come to define the imperialist era. Repartition means inevitable conflict.
This inescapable need for repartition, driven by the dynamics of finance capital, takes us directly into Section 4, the struggle between state capitalist trusts and the inevitability of war. If the globe is divided, conflict seems guaranteed whenever the relative strength of the powers changes.
Exactly. And the conflict starts at the most basic level, the scramble for raw materials, the big monopolies, the trusts and cartels. They understand intuitively that their power, their ability to dictate prices, is only truly secure when they control all the sources of essential raw materials.
Why all of them? Isn't controlling a majority enough?
Not in the long run, because any independent source could potentially be used by a competitor or could undercut their pricing. So finance capital begins this relentless global hunt for timber, for cotton, for leather, for ores, for oil. And not just existing sources, but potential future sources too. Colonial possession comes to be seen as the only complete guarantee against the uncertainties of competition and the maneuvers of rival monopolies. There's a constant fear of being left behind, of a rival securing a resource you need.
This fear even pushed manufacturers, who were normally competitors, to organize internationally, didn't it? Just to manage access to scarce resources.
Yes, you saw things like the International Federation of Cotton Spinners Associations, founded in 1904, or the European Federation of Flax Spinners Associations in 1910. These were attempts by manufacturers themselves to collectively manage growing shortages and competition for raw materials, driven by the pressures of the monopoly system.
To really see this conflict in action, the sources often use the oil industry as a prime example, right? The global oil trust war.
Yes, it's a classic case study. It perfectly demonstrates this fusion of huge private monopolies battling each other, backed by and sometimes manipulating their respective state powers. It's finance capital in action on the world stage.
Okay, let's trace the story of that struggle. Who were the main players involved?
Well, on one side, you had the dominant force, Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust from the U.S. It often operated internationally through various daughter companies, sometimes strategically based in places like Holland, to better compete with its main global rival, the Anglo-Dutch Shell Trust.
So, U.S. versus British-Dutch interest primarily. Where did Germany fit in?
German finance capital, led by giants like the Deutsche Bank, also desperately wanted a piece of the action. They tried to organize the Romanian oil fields, which were significant then, and unite them with Russian oil interests, hoping to create a bloc powerful enough to challenge Rockefeller's dominance.
So, German finance capital was actively trying to build a strategic counterweight in oil against the American behemoth. How did that turn out?
Not well for the Germans initially. Despite the immense resources and political backing of the Deutsche Bank, they were apparently outmaneuvered and decisively defeated by the Rockefeller Trust around 1907.
Defeated how?
They were basically forced into a corner. German finance capital had to choose. Either liquidate its substantial oil interests entirely, admitting defeat, or submit to the American trust's terms. They chose submission. They signed a deeply disadvantageous agreement that essentially promised they wouldn't injure American oil interests anywhere in the world. A major climb down.
But the German magnates didn't just accept this defeat quietly, did they?
Yep.
This humiliation seems to have triggered a major push for state intervention back home.
It absolutely did. This defeat directly led to what the sources humorously called the Comedy of Oil. A very prominent director of the Deutsche Bank, a man named von Gwinner, launched this furious public campaign demanding that the German state create a national oil monopoly.
Why would a private banker want the state to take over?
To fight Rockefeller. They mobilized the national press, whipped up all this patriotic indignation about the American yoke, arguing that only the power of the German state could protect German interests and challenge the American trust effectively. And the German parliament, the Reichstag, responding to this intense lobbying from finance capital, actually almost unanimously voted in favor of drafting a state oil monopoly bill.
That's a perfect illustration of that interweaving you talked about earlier. A private financial interest gets humiliated, so it demands the state nationalize an entire industry purely as a weapon to defeat a foreign private monopoly.
It's exactly that. German finance capital was attempting to wield the entire state apparatus, its political weight, its legal authority, presumably its military backing if needed, simply to secure immense private profits for itself by cheating its American rival on the world stage.
Did the state monopoly actually happen?
Ironically, no. The project ultimately collapsed just before the First World War, around 1913, apparently due to a combination of factors: fierce infighting among the different German banks about who would control this state-backed entity, and also, crucially, the government getting cold feet about provoking Rockefeller too much right when they were trying to secure American financing for sensitive war preparations. Politics and finance got very complicated.
Fascinating. And this struggle for control, this division of the world, it wasn't just about physical resources like oil. It extended to controlling the infrastructure of global trade itself, like shipping.
Oh, definitely. Merchant shipping, which is like the bloodstream of global commerce, underwent exactly the same process of division by giant monopolies. The huge German shipping lines, Hammer America and Norddeutscher Lloyd, actually formed a long-term 20-year agreement with J.P. Morgan's International Mercantile Marine Company, which was a massive American-British shipping trust.
And what was the purpose of their agreement?
Explicitly to divide up the world's ocean traffic lanes between them, and crucially to maintain high, non-competitive freight rates. A global shipping cartel, basically.
And you mentioned there was a particularly telling clause in that 20-year agreement, something that revealed their underlying assumptions.
Yes, a very critical and, you might say, prudent provision was included.
Okay.
The entire agreement would be immediately null and void in the event of war between their home countries.
Though they knew.
They knew. They understood perfectly well that the elaborate economic division of the world they had created was artificial and temporary. It depended entirely on the continuation of peace, enforced by the power balance between their respective states. The moment those states went to war, the private economic truce was off.
So let's loop back to the core idea here. Why is this conflict, this constant pressure for repartition, considered structurally inevitable? Why couldn't these giant trusts just agree to share the world peacefully and permanently?
Because, according to this analysis, the way spheres of influence and economic territories are divided under capitalism isn't based on, justice or fairness or long-term stability. It's based purely on a calculation of strength.
Strength meaning?
Financial strength, economic strength, industrial capacity, and ultimately military strength. And the critical factor is that the relative strength of the different imperialist powers changes unevenly and often very rapidly.
Because of uneven development.
Exactly. Think about Germany. Half a century before World War I, it was relatively insignificant compared to Great Britain or France. But by 1900, its industrial and economic growth was explosive, far outpacing the older powers. Britain had the historical advantage, the huge empire, but Germany was catching up fast in terms of raw power. Since the existing division of the world, based on the old balance of power, no longer reflects the new balance of power created by this uneven growth, it cannot remain static. Redivision becomes necessary from the perspective of the rising powers.
And how can that redivision happen when everything is already claimed?
The only conceivable basis for carrying out that redivision in a world where territory and economic spheres are already owned is a trial by strength, a test of force. Therefore, conflict culminating in war is not seen as accidental or a mistake or bad policy. It's viewed as the necessary, inevitable, logical outcome of the system of monopoly capitalism itself.
Hey listener, do you have any other idea or question about this? Please write in comments. This analysis of structurally inevitable conflict brings us to the final section, Section 5, which looks at the profound social and political consequences within the imperialist countries themselves, the parasitic nature and the militarization of the state.
Right. The growth and dominance of finance capital doesn't just change international relations, it fundamentally transforms the nature of the state itself. This intense concentration of capital leads towards a tendency to uh, nationalize capitalist interests, to fuse them with the state. Advanced national economies begin to look less like collections of competing firms and more like huge, highly organized state capitalist trusts, to use Bukharin's term again.
So if the national economy starts operating like one giant trust,
Then the state power itself inevitably becomes the domain, the executive committee of the financial oligarchy that controls that trust.
the state serves finance capital.
It acts as the highest organizational culmination of the trust structure. And this structural integration, this merger of big finance and state power, leads directly to what observers at the time called the crisis of parliamentarism.
Meaning parliament becomes irrelevant.
Or at least its role changes dramatically. The parliament, which is theoretically the voice of the people or the forum for democratic debate, increasingly just becomes a rubber stamp. It merely sanctions decisions that have already been worked out beforehand, often in secret, by the consolidated business organizations, the big banks, and the state bureaucracy they influence. The modern bourgeoisie, united into what the sources call one solid reactionary mass, demands a strong power, a strong executive state, precisely because they need it to execute their collective financial dictates, both at home and abroad.
And what specific role does militarism play within this new state capitalist trust structure? It surely becomes more than just national defense.
Oh, much more. It becomes an essential economic tool. Imperialism fundamentally replaces the old ideology of laissez-faire, of free markets and minimal government with a kind of new, aggressive mercantilism. And militarism is an indispensable attribute of this new reality. It's a weapon used constantly in the economic struggle between these rival state capitalist trusts.
How so?
Well, first, you saw the monstrous, almost unbelievable escalation in military spending by all the major powers in the decades leading up to World War I. This wasn't accidental. It was competitive armament driven by economic rivalry.
And this military power was used even in peacetime, you're saying?
Absolutely. Military and political pressure was constantly deployed to back up finance capital's interests abroad, to secure concessions, contracts, and favorable investment conditions. Remember the Deutsche Bank's railway projects in Turkey? They received powerful political support from the German state, including diplomatic pressure and sometimes even veiled military threats, to help them secure those contracts and ward off French competitors. The war itself, which, as you mentioned, the sources estimate costs something like 300 million marks per day at its peak,
An astronomical sum.
exposes militarism not just as a cause of suffering, but as a tool of immense strategic economic waste designed ultimately to forcibly repartition the globe in favor of the winning coalition of finance capital.
Let's turn finally to the impact within the imperialist countries. The sources talk about the parasitic nature of imperialism, especially concerning the working class in those advanced nations.
Yes, this is absolutely critical for understanding the political dynamics and particularly the phenomenon of opportunism within the workers' movement. The argument is that the extremely high monopoly profits generated not just from domestic exploitation, but from the super exploitation of colonies and financially dependent territories, create the economic possibility for the capitalists to bribe certain sections of their own working class at home.
Bribe them how?
By allowing them somewhat higher wages, better working conditions, or more stable employment compared to both the workers in the colonies and the lower strata of the working class at home. The English writer J.A. Hobson, who was a liberal critic of imperialism, noted this quite sharply. He said imperialism uses colonies, quote, to enrich its ruling class and to bribe its lower classes into acquiescence.
This sounds exactly like the economic basis for what Marxists call the labor aristocracy.
It's precisely that. This bribery creates a privileged, often skilled, higher-paid stratum of workers who become detached economically and politically from the broad, unskilled, and often unorganized masses of the proletariat. Their interests start to align, or at least appear to align, more with the success of their own national bourgeoisie and their own nation's imperial project, rather than with international working-class solidarity.
Their thinking shifts.
Their thinking shifts. It becomes, the better the business of our company or our nation's empire, the better it is for me personally. They receive a relative improvement in their standard of living, but this improvement is funded, in essence, by the intensified exploitation happening elsewhere in the empire or in the lower layers of their own society. This is seen as the crucial economic bond between imperialism and the rise of opportunist, reformist, non-revolutionary tendencies within the labor movement of the imperialist countries.
Can we see concrete evidence of this bribery or splitting of the working class?
The sources point to things like changing migration patterns and labor market structures. For example, in Great Britain, the main imperial power emigration of British workers actually slowed down significantly after about 1884, suggesting conditions improved enough for the upper layer to stay home. Simultaneously, in places like the United States, you saw the massive importation of immigrant labor from Southern and Eastern Europe who were forced into the lowest paid, most dangerous, most exploited jobs.
Creating a hierarchy.
Exactly. A hierarchy where the established, often Anglo-Saxon American workers occupied the better paid, more skilled supervisory roles, the labor aristocracy, while the newer immigrants formed the super exploited base. Imperialism uses cheap foreign labor as a lever, both to increase profits and to divide the domestic working class against itself.
But the argument concludes that the First World War ultimately shatters this entire parasitic arrangement, this illusion of shared interest.
It shatters it brutally. The sheer, colossal, unforgivable cost of the war, the millions butchered in the trenches, the billions upon billions wasted on destruction, the crushing burden of conscription, debt, and militarism on everyone, it exposes the absolute bankruptcy of the whole imperialist system and the labor aristocracy's bargain with it.
The bribe wasn't worth the price.
Not even close. Those few extra pennies or shillings that some European workers might have received indirectly from colonial policy were utterly insignificant compared to the price paid in blood, suffering, and the degradation of becoming cannon fodder. The system, in its war phase, transforms the worker into what the sources call a white slave of the predatory imperialist state attached not to the land anymore, but directly to the industrial plant, forced to serve the collective war aims of the state capitalist trust.
So the war itself becomes the ultimate catalyst.
It's the ultimate contradiction laid bare. It's the moment, according to this analysis, that violently severs the final ideological chains binding the proletariat to their masters. It forces them, through the sheer horror and necessity of self-preservation, to finally grasp their true, independent class interests in a social revolution against the entire imperialist system that produced the war. So to bring it all together, this is the historical summation presented in these texts. Imperialism isn't just another policy or a temporary phase. It is, in Lenin's famous words, moribund capitalism, dying capitalism.
Moribund.
Meaning it's reached a stage where its internal contradictions are so intense, so explosive, they are crying to heaven, as one writer put it. Capitalism, in its competitive phase, tried to overcome its inherent anarchy and crises by forming giant monopolies. But in doing so, it didn't eliminate anarchy, it just recreated it on a vastly larger, more destructive scale, unleashing the devils of a world scuffle between these gigantic state capitalist trusts.
It solved one problem by creating a bigger one.
Exactly. And it tried to subdue social contradictions and class struggle at home by using the colonial safety valve, by exporting capital and bribing a section of the working class. But this only delayed the inevitable and, in fact, prepared an even bigger explosion of the entire global capitalist boiler through World War.
Yet the analysis doesn't end on a purely negative note. The very forces that created this destructive system are also seen as preparing the ground for something new.
Precisely. The immense concentration and socialization of production, the very organization of capital required by imperialism, inadvertently creates the material conditions, the large-scale industry, the infrastructure, the interconnected global economy necessary for a different, more rational system. And it also creates the social force, the concentrated, organized industrial proletariat, the gravediggers of the bourgeoisie, as Marx called them, capable of bringing about that change.
So the argument is that the continuous bloody conflicts, the environmental destruction, the dictation of finance capital, all inherent features of this final stage cannot be overcome through tinkering, through reforms, or wishful thinking within the system itself.
The analysis concludes that the only genuine path forward, the only way to overcome the parasitism, the waste, and the violence of imperialism is through a consciously planned socialist organization of economic life on a global scale, one that replaces the anarchy of the market and the dictates of finance capital with rational cooperation for human need.
The historical dialectic, perhaps. Even the most destructive phases contain the seeds of their own overcoming.
That's the underlying message. The dynamics of history from this perspective ensure that even the most brutal manifestations of a dying system like imperialism are ultimately transient, paving the way, through struggle, for a fundamentally new social structure.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. See you on next episode, comrades. Bye-bye.